Hello, everyone. This week in the history of modern Russia, we're going to talk about a very, very significant period, certainly in Russian history, obviously in world history. This is World War II. We're going to look at this primarily from the Soviet Union's perspective. Obviously, it sort of goes without saying that the Second World War is a highly significant moment in modern history. We'll talk about really why this moment was particularly significant for the development of the Soviet Union and also of modern Russia today. Before I get into this element of our factoid this week, the information, the basic information that will form the background for our lesson for this week, I want to also just remind everyone we do have our paper proposal due this week. Important element of the paper proposal. Let me just kind of talk about a few of these. First of all, you need to have a preliminary list of sources. I want 5 academic sources. A couple of those can be sources drawn from our assigned material from class, but I am looking for outside research. So if I look at your list of sources and see very little outside research, you could lose points for that. So, please keep that in mind. There's lots and lots of opportunities for research that are available to us online. So obviously you can go visit the college library, but also you have online access to our library, and through that, many databases, access to electronic versions of books, and of course we have interlibrary loan systems too that we can use in addition to other channels for research. For a paper like this too, it should be noted, this is the paper obviously will be due at the end of the term, but for a paper like this, you don't really need to be doing a massive amount of primary source research. Obviously, if you're able to do some primary source research, that's great. But generally speaking, secondary resources written by and published by historians and related fields and academic publishers, this is fine. Historical monographs written by professional historians, journal articles, and certainly you can draw in, if you want to draw in primary sources or periodicals and so forth to help give context, absolutely. But the paper, by and large, will be based on research of secondary sources, sources written by professional historians, sources like, again, professional journal articles written by academic historical publishing journals, as well as academic monographs, books written by historians, and again, published academically by professional historians. I want to see 5 of those sources, preliminary sources, and they should be in bibliographical form conforming to Chicago Manual of Style. And I'll provide us with a link to the online free Chicago Manual of Style website so that you can access these, and be sure just to follow the template for these types of sources directly, and then you won't have any worries about the source being entered incorrectly. Also, really important note, this doesn't mean you have to use all of these sources on the paper. Okay, this is preliminary research. This is research where I want to see that you are sort of beginning to think about the paper, beginning to conduct some research. None of the stuff in terms of your thesis statement or those resources are you like locked into once you submit this. Certainly, if there is a radical change in your thesis and or paper topic, let me know so we can talk about it to make sure it's going to be a doable, paper. But you're not locked into this. These are preliminary, and as you do research, as you investigate, it's very likely, almost expected, that your thesis will change a bit as you begin to delve into the subject that you've chosen. I have a preliminary list of just possible topics. If you're thinking about a topic, I have some of those for you. I have samples for paper proposals as well. So find those in modules. Now, on the proposal, I want those 5 preliminary resources. I want a thesis statement. Remember, when you're writing a paper, make the thesis specific. Okay, you don't want a thesis that is super broad, because you're not going to be able to cover a really, really broad topic in an essay like this. So make sure it's a focused thesis statement. Okay, so here's an example that relates directly to a thesis statement that relates directly to what we're talking about this week. You know, a thesis could be something like, during the early stages of the Second World War, the Soviet Union committed atrocities against the Polish people. One of these atrocities was the Katyn massacre, in which 4,400 Polish soldiers were executed and buried in the Katyn forest in Poland. This massacre sowed the seeds for fundamental distrust and resistance within Poland. And then the essay could talk about the Katyn massacre, and it could explain how the Katyn massacre became a point of contention and demands for reform during the Soviet period of control in Poland. This is one example, just kind of off the top of my head. But that's a specific thesis. You're going to do it on the Katyn massacre and how the Katyn massacre sowed seeds of resistance and efforts of reform and even revolution in Soviet-controlled Poland. I want to see, in addition, and this is very important, I want you to write the introduction to the paper, and again, this stuff can change, but I want to see you take a shot at writing the introduction of the paper. Our paper should have 2-paragraph introductions. The first paragraph should be a narrative hook. A narrative hook, if you read sources, if you find some primary sources are great for developing a narrative hook. A narrative hook is kind of a first-hand account that draws the reader into the subject, right? So a description, again, if you were writing about the Katyn massacre, then you might have a description of a first-hand account of the experience of the Katyn massacre, or the perception of the Katyn massacre from Polish citizens in the aftermath when they began to learn more about this in the post-World War II era. But if you found a primary source about it, or maybe it's about the directive, maybe you were able to find a Soviet directive about the Katyn massacre. But you could use that as the narrative hook to draw the reader in, provide a first-hand account of this event. And then in the second paragraph, this is where you set up the argument. This is where you present your thesis statement. This is where you say, this is what this paper is going to answer, the questions this paper is going to answer. This is why this paper matters, and this is why you should read this paper. And finish it with, a clear thesis statement. Okay, so let's do this week. So, thesis, 5 preliminary sources, a 2-paragraph introduction. That includes a narrative hook. To the summary of the information for this week, we're looking at the Soviet Union during World War II. The 3 maps you're seeing are really telling maps. This first map is what Europe, Germany, and the Soviet Union, particularly highlighted here, obviously Germany in green, the Soviet Union over here in the orange, what the map of Europe and the Soviet Union looked like between the end of World War II and the beginning of the Second World War. This map, of course, is Europe at the height of the expansion of the Nazi Empire during the Second World War, with obviously the Eastern Front here in the Soviet Union in the pink, light pink here, with Stalingrad over here, the siege of Petersburg, St. Petersburg, at the time known as Leningrad over here. Of course, again, Stalingrad over here today is known as Volgograd. We'll talk about that renaming in subsequent weeks. And, of course, approaching the frontier of Moscow up in here. And, of course, Ukraine is right down here. And here you see, of course, a map of Western Europe during the Cold War, during particularly the 50s. You have countries like Austria that were able to remain outside of the Soviet bloc, largely by establishing itself as a neutral country, a similar narrative for Finland, okay? But you witness the Baltic countries up in here, becoming sort of swallowed up into the Soviet Empire. Similar story for Poland, other countries in the Eastern Bloc, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, which becomes, of course, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Romania, down here. Yugoslavia becomes an independent communist state outside of the realm of the Soviet Empire. And, of course, East Germany, with Berlin right here as sort of an island where you had this divided city with Western influence on or the Allied influence on the West, the United States, the British, the French, West Germany, and the west portion of the city, and of course on the east, the Soviet influenced eastern part of the city, which under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev will be formally divided with the Berlin Wall, of course. A sort of microcosm of the division during the Cold War. We'll be talking more about the Cold War, obviously, in subsequent weeks. So here you see what you're looking at really, it conveys a very significant expansion of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, rather small, obviously, following the end of World War I, where the Soviet leaders signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and ultimately, the boundaries of the Soviet Empire were much smaller than they would become with respects to the Soviet Empire that most people remember. A Soviet Empire that would control places like Poland, the Baltic countries like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia up here, controlling this area, which is East Prussia. Today is still, this area right here is still, this is Kaliningrad, this is still part of Russia today. And of course, all of these countries in here, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, these were all part of the Soviet Empire. So, this is kind of the direction of the factoid this week. I mentioned the Katyn massacre, which involved the massacre of some 4,400 Polish individuals who were then buried in the Katyn forest. The Sovietization of these areas of Central and Eastern Europe was brutal, as I'm sure you're not very surprised. And actually, if you were, for example, a member of Poland in the Cold War period, you would see this as a great betrayal as well, because, of course, many of you probably know that at the outset of World War II, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which on the one hand, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1938 had two components. There was one component that was sort of open and out there. There was another component that was secret. The open and out there component was that there was basically an economic and trade relationship between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And this allowed Hitler, of course, when he was invading non-Russian portions of Europe, he could be guaranteed effectively the economic benefit of that trade with the Soviet Union prior to Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, which of course occurs in June 22nd, 1941, which for historians, we know that that was always Nazi Germany's plan. That was always Hitler's plan to invade Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, to create Lebensraum, or living space, for the Aryan German people, the ethnic German people that were constructed as the vote. It was to create this racial empire, right? But at the time, that was not clearly known. The secret part of the treaty, and this is a big reason why there would be a great deal of animosity towards the Soviet Union as more of this becomes known during the Cold War within places like Poland. This also involved a secret part in which effectively Germany and the Soviet Union made agreements about who would control what in a new world that was a new Europe that would be dominated effectively by the German Empire and the Soviet Empire. And so Germany effectively allowed the Soviet Union the right to take over and control the Baltic states up here, okay, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, and of course Finland up here. And of course portions of Poland will go to the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union would accept a majority of the territory going to Nazi Germany. And so there was this kind of betrayal of many of these places in the outset of the conflict. despite the fact that, of course, the narrative that would be immediately conveyed was that the Soviet Union came to these places as liberators. But ultimately, the truth would be known that, in fact, the Soviet Union had sought to create, in agreement with Nazi Germany, that it hoped would allow for its expansion of its imperial territory along with that of Nazi Germany. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, the fascists in Germany and the communists in Eastern Europe were never, ever like friends. Those are two ideologies. While both are totalitarian in nature, at the time, there are two ideologies that are just completely opposed, right, in terms of how they sort of see the world. In fact, it was the communists that Hitler used to blame for the Reichstag fire at the beginning of his control in the early 1930s that really resulted in his ability to seize dictatorial power. He blamed the communists for burning the Reichstag. So these were groups that were fundamentally at odds. And this is not lost on Stalin and the Soviets, but they thought that they were sort of getting the better of the deal, and they did not guess that Nazi Germany would be able to invade the Soviet Union. They highly overestimated their own position and underestimated that of Germany to an almost shocking sense. Even to the extent that when the new border following the beginning of the war, of course the war starts formally in Europe September 1st, 1939, but the new border of Poland was the Bug River. And of course, so the German army was on one side, just before Operation Barbarossa in 1941, and the Soviet Union was on the other. There were actually deserting German soldiers that swam across the Bug River to effectively warn the Soviet Union of this coming invasion. And they were subsequently executed as spies. Stalin did almost nothing to prepare the Soviet Union for what to historians looked like an almost just inevitable invasion at that time, in that moment. And that really set the Soviet Union up for a really catastrophic first 2 years of war on the Eastern Front. Okay, so sorry, this is a long announcement. I apologize for that. If you were summarizing the factoid, I would say in the Soviet conquest of Eastern Europe, the defeat of Nazi Germany, as well as in the acquisition of territories as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union, too, was quite violent and repressive in its Sovietization of these areas. It sent thousands of people to the gulags. It executed individuals, groups of the Polish armed forces, for example, in events like the Katyn massacre. It sent even teachers and workers to gulag labor camps from places in the Baltic states. Again, like the countries of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, up in the Baltic regions. It was particularly repressive in its effort to Sovietize these areas as it took control of them. And the ramifications of that were really sowing the seeds of revolution and resistance over the long term within those areas of the Soviet Empire. When the Soviet Empire comes to control these areas, there will be, especially as more and more is learned and understood, there will be a great deal of distrust and resistance, when possible, to the Soviet Empire's control as a result of these sort of atrocities and betrayals that were committed on these sovereign nations at the outset and in the aftermath of the Second World War. So summarize that. I'm sorry this is so long. I will make this worth some extra points. Let's have a great week, everyone. And the discussion forum this week will be limited, by the way, as the slide goes away there. The discussion forum will be limited this week. And I'll see everyone in there because we have the paper proposal. So I'll see everyone this week.